do not hide things in the fog. It's like realization is generally an effortful process. Like you're alerted to your own wrongdoing by glimmerings of conscience, let's say, feelings of shame and doubt. But you have to unpack those to find out exactly what you're doing wrong. And that's really hard. It's effortful. And so you can just not do it. And the way you don't do it is you take refuge in your blind conformity. And that's part of that pluralistic ignorance. And I suppose that's one of the flaws of the argument that you laid out. It's like, yeah, people were pluralistically ignorant, but how much of that was turning a blind eye? And you can maintain a very high level of plausible ignorance by turning a blind eye. And you know, in the ancient Egyptian story that I'm so enamored with, the story of Osiris and his degeneration. So he's the god of the state. Osiris degenerates because he turns a blind eye to the machinations of his evil brother. He could know, but he decides not to. And that's a moral sin in my estimation. And so out of the story that you told with regards to pluralistic ignorance, I would add a psychological component is, yeah, well, how much could have people known if they would have allowed themselves to investigate instead of refusing it? So, you know, with Freud, you have the idea of repression. You know something uncomfortable and you suppress it, and it's there and you can rediscover it. But it's not exactly right, because what happens is that you have a hint that something's rotten in the state of Denmark, and that elicits an exploratory tendency and an avoidance tendency as well. And you can just leave it unpacked. And then the rot that you're detecting subliminally, let's say, accumulates around you. And if it accumulates enough, it turns into the dragon of chaos. It's like, and then you get the situation that you described. By the time that you can no longer turn a blind eye, the thing that you avoided is so monstrous that you cannot prevail against it. So I would still say, even if that entire explanatory story is correct, it misses the moral culpability element, which is, yeah, okay, just how much could have you known? You know, and I have some sympathy for this. Believe me, I understand why people are blind to the horrors of malevolence, let's say, because malevolence, when confronted, is traumatizing. And you see that in the post-traumatic stress disorder literature. It's contact with malevolence that traumatizes people. You know, the contact with someone who really, really wants to hurt them. And they're shocked by that can even exist. It's terrible, especially when you start looking into it. It undoes you, it unglues you, especially if you are a naive believer in the, you know, untrammeled goodness of human beings, or even of existence. Because if there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. You know, he believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all, you had to be disciplined, that's for sure. But you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia, and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you know, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that. But from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil. Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so you know, again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he could talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine, and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they were just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It's like, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in oil rigs or whatever, and you could do that in Alberta at that time. That was really hard work, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you also see that like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. One of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. Get your act together. You've got things to do in the world. The absence of your full being in the world leaves a hole that is filled by terrible things. At minimum, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the world doesn't devolve into something approximating hell. And at maximum, you have the responsibility, again, and it's a heavy ethical responsibility, to do everything that's in your power to make things as good as you can possibly make them, in this sophisticated manner that takes you and your family and your community into account. And it's on you, right? And that's meaning. People say, well, I'd like to have a meaningful life. It's like, well, fair enough, but the price that you pay for the meaning that transcends tragedy is the adoption of responsibility for the catastrophe of existence. But that ennobles you, right? It makes you into someone strong and someone competent and someone who's worthwhile and who lives in a manner that justifies their own suffering. And there's nothing better than you could possibly do than that.